Very welcome to the very first webinar of the Early Career Toolkit as part of the Voices activities, as part of the Voices community. So welcome. First and foremost, I just wanted to say that if you can, if you're comfortable, please turn your camera on. That would be very helpful so that we can also see your lovely faces. And then we'll get started. We started recording this session. If you wouldn't like us to either have your camera picture or your name on the meeting, just let us know, and we'll only publish the beginning of the session accordingly. And we will also stop the recording at the point where we start an exercise. So hopefully that will help us create a space that is a bit more, that helps people share and experiences as well as thoughts. And so with that, just a bit of an introduction about Voices. Welcome everyone. This is the Voices community and the Early Career Toolkit. Voices is a non-for-profit community that grew out of the Global Shapers Network. We started working together in 2018 with Global Shapers from Dublin Hub and from Cambridge Hub in Ireland and UK respectively. And then ever since, we've been growing with amazing team members from all over the world really. And with ideas, partnerships, Voices ambassadors from very different cultures, countries, ideas, professions, industries, really. And so the Early Career Toolkit is going to be about supporting one another, supporting you in learning skills that will be hopefully helpful for you in your respective careers. We are hoping this to become a curriculum that will be running in the next 6 months, as such that hopefully you will be able to join all, or at least as many as you can, of the activities that we'll have throughout. So as you might very well know, we will have the monthly workshops at the very last Friday of each month. And then in between, we have a Slack community that we set up. We will be sharing the link to that Slack community to you, with you today as well as part of this workshop. I see a lot of familiar names here, so I'm very glad to see that. But if you are joining us for the first time, then you're very welcome to join the Slack community too. That's a community and a platform on which we are hoping to facilitate some in-depth learning. What that means is that we'll be asking some questions and facilitate discussions there. So today we will be talking about challenging conversations with Bradley Rood. So Bradley is the founder and the managing director of Green Sea Coaching. And since 2005, he's been helping senior executives as well as business owners managing change, creating their better futures through delivery of executive and management coaching. He gained his coaching qualifications from the Academy of Executive Coaching, the Coaches Training Institute, and as well as from various other organizations. He's also managing the North London Chamber of Commerce, and he's a business advisor on the Inspiring Women Growth program delivered by Enterprise Enfield. And so this is the context from which I know him. So Bradley, very welcome. Thanks for joining us today. I think I can honestly say that everyone on this community is really excited to learn from you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sophia, and great to meet everybody virtually. And I'd like to thank Sophia and the team from Voices for giving me the opportunity to make the presentation today. I'm just going to share my screen and hopefully you'll all be able to see it.
We can see it very well.
Yeah, here we go. Excellent stuff. So, as Sophia mentioned, I've worked with many clients over a number of years, helping them to sort of navigate the tricky process of successful outcomes on challenging conversations. And what I'd like to do is share some of that learning and knowledge with you today. And I think it's fair to say, as you go through your personal and professional lives, it's almost guaranteed that you will have several challenging conversations. And I'm sure that many of you have already had several in the past as well. So what are we going to look at today? We're going to look at what a challenging conversation is, a definition of that. We'll move on through a couple of stages to look at a challenging conversations framework that will helpfully take you through a process that will enable you to have more successful outcomes in the future. We'll look at some of the cross-cultural challenges of having these types of conversations. There'll be a Q&A. We're going to go out into some breakout rooms and do an exercise based on your own experiences. We'll come back and then have some final thoughts before moving on. So just before we sort of move forward, I want to clearly define what we're all talking about in terms of a challenging conversation. And it's important that we're all, on the same hymn sheet, if you like. So for today's presentation, a challenging conversation is one that's going to be viewed as one whose primary subject matter is potentially contentious and or sensitive and may elicit strong, complex emotions that can be hard to predict or control. So I think if you bear that in mind as we go through, that should be quite helpful. So before we get into the actual sort of body of the presentation, I just want to launch a quick poll. And I'd like you to think back to a time when you've had a challenging or difficult conversation yourself, and it could be personal or work related. How did you come away feeling after that conversation? There are three options, and I'd just like you to tick one of the options. You were happy and content, achieved the outcome you were looking for, neutral, frustrated, no outcome was reached, and unhappy, happy you didn't get the outcome you were looking for. I'll give you another sort of 10, 20 seconds to complete the poll, and then we'll have a look what's happened. Okay. So I'm just going to end the polling. And so what we've seen here, which is great to see, that 54% of you came away happy and content and achieved the outcome you were looking for, 31% neutral, frustrated, and only a small percentage were unhappy. Perhaps some of you should be doing the presentation as well as me, but hopefully we can improve the percentages of those that are happy and content as a result of the presentation. So I'm just going to close the poll and move on. For some reason. So what's really interesting, the Chartered Management Institute did some research last year in the UK, looking at what were perceived to be the most difficult conversation. And the interesting piece that came out of this survey was that the top four, which were anything to do with pay packets and salaries, inappropriate behaviour in the workplace, feedback on poor performance, and promotions, all of the top four are the conversations that happen in the workplace. Now, this doesn't mean that some of the personal conversations are any less important or have less of an impact from an emotional perspective, but what it suggests is, as you go through your careers, more of these conversations are going to be taking place in the workplace. And I suppose the worrying thing from a British point of view, what this poll and survey suggests is that people find it much easier to sort of dump their partner than they do to ask their boss for a salary increase, and that might just be a sort of a British trait. But again, most of these conversations are going to have some sort of emotional context that come to the fore, and they're all important. And we'll move on and have a look at why they're challenging. So emotions are usually strong, and I think if one can control one's emotions during these conversations, you're going to achieve a much better outcome. People have different views, they have different perspectives on what's happened. So these conversations have to be two-way. They can't just be a one-way conversation. It might impact on self-esteem before, during, and after the conversation. You might be anxious about how the conversation is going to turn out, which again can impact on the way that the conversation happens. Fear of failure is another common issue why these are challenging. And where it starts to get really interesting and difficult is if you really care about the issue itself and the other person that's involved, that can make it even more challenging. You may have had bad past experiences of similar conversations, and there's often a power difference between the people involved. So as per the survey from the CMI, if you're going to have to go and ask your boss for a salary increase, how do you navigate that, come out with the outcome that you're looking for? And if you don't quite get the outcome, making sure that it doesn't damage your prospects in the future. So when you're having a challenging conversation, there are actually three conversations that are going on during that process. There's the what happened conversation, the feelings conversation, and the identity conversation. We're going to have a quick look at those. So the what happened conversation, this typically involves people disagreeing about what really and actually happened or what should have happened. And it's generally based on the assumption that I'm right and you're wrong. And this is where people spend a lot of time during challenging conversations. Who's to blame, who's not to blame, who's right, who's wrong, who played their part, who didn't play their part. And the conversation's often filled at this point with lots of assumptions that aren't true. And that makes it even more difficult to move the conversation forward and come to some sort of resolution. And what generally happens is that people get locked into their story being the right story and the only story. And in fact, it's the other person who's the problem. The next part of the conversation that's going on is the feelings conversation. And this one's very much about how to identify and manage strong feelings and emotions when they arise. And these feelings and emotions will come to the surface during challenging conversations. And people talk to themselves about, remaining rational, but when these feelings and emotions come to the surface, it's quite difficult, and people often struggle with understanding and expressing their feelings. And I think the other issue around the feelings piece is that when they come up, it can also make people feel very vulnerable and uncomfortable as well. The third conversation that's going on is the identity conversation. And this one's very much the under the surface, quiet conversation. We have it inside our own head. And it's about who we are and how we see ourselves. And we'll ask ourselves many identity questions before, during, and after the challenging conversations. So, for example, will it change my sense of who I am? Will it expose some of my self-doubts? How will the other person see me afterwards? How will I see myself afterwards? And these questions and concerns are especially relevant when challenging conversations aren't going as well as you'd like them to do so. So bearing in mind the three conversations that are going on, we're going to move into the framework itself. And not surprisingly, the first point is getting started. And it's at this point, your first big decision is whether you want to proceed with and or need to have this challenging conversation in the first place. Is there a more effective way that you can solve the problem without going down the conversation route? Should you let it go, perhaps, because it's not important enough and or the relationship risk may be greater than the actual gain from having the conversation? But if you decide you're going to move ahead, the next part of the process is preparing and planning for the conversation. And at this point, you need to ask yourself and answer the two following questions. Why do you need to have the conversation? And what's the outcome that you're looking for from having the conversation? And you need to keep both of those things in mind at all stages. So having asked and answered those two questions, the next point is inviting the person to participate. And you want to do that in a way that's going to make them feel comfortable, not raise any anxieties, and hopefully lead to a position where you can have a successful two-way conversation. So you can use terms such as, I was wondering if we can talk about the particular project you're working on. I'm not sure I'm correct in my thinking about how the team's performing. I want to check with you about how you've seen the figures over the last couple of months. So it's quite an open, it's not a sort of a contentious or an aggressive approach. And at this early stage as well of inviting the person, you also want to express your purpose. So again, you can use phrases such as, I want us to express our different points of view about the project. I want to hear how you see the problem with the team performance. And I want to reach agreement on how we can move forward. And I think that's an important point to mention it's about moving forward. It's not being stuck in the past. And then it comes to your opening statement. And this is where you need to do a lot of planning and preparation. And it's important to write out, refine, and practice the content of your opening statement, because this is where many challenging conversations fall at the first hurdle before they've even started. And one of the ways you can do this, just to share a tip, to practice your opening statement, if you've got Zoom or you can use your mobile phone, just take a video of yourself practicing and saying out loud what your opening statement's going to be. Because if you just say it in your head quietly, it will sound very different to what it sounds like when you're doing it in reality. And you'll often find that you'll need to make some changes to what the opening statement is. You can also use your voice recording app on your phone as well. And the issue here, the importance of getting it right, is that it's really difficult to recover from a poorly crafted and poorly delivered opening statement, because it could be viewed as an honest invitation for a two-way conversation, or it could be seen as a threat. And if it's seen that way, it's going to close the other person down and make it much more difficult to have that sort of conversation. So your opening statement really needs to communicate exactly what you want to say, as that would have the greatest chance of generating a positive result for both parties. And because of its importance, it can also be the most stressful part of the conversation as well. So things you need to consider in the opening statement are things such as describing your purpose. So this is about mutual understanding and problem solving. You want to talking about moving forward, figuring out how you can move forward and resolve the issues at hand. You want to be able to clearly state your view as you see it, but also invite the other person and let them know that you're going to listen to their story and their perspective as well. Next part of the framework is linked to challenging your assumptions and beliefs. And if you go into a conversation arrogantly, assuming you know everything there is to know about the topic, you think you know exactly what the other person's going to say before they've even said it and before the meeting's even started, this is a real recipe for failure. So it's about not prejudging the situation, going into the meeting having already made your mind up about it, because again, that's going to be damaging. It's going to discourage the other person from meeting you halfway and making sure that you can reach an agreement. And I think the other thing at this point, when you're having these conversations, it's really important to distinguish between opinions and facts. And when we talk about facts, ideally, you want to know firsthand what the facts are. So you might have seen somebody do something, heard somebody say something, you've seen the figures that are appropriate to the situation you're going to discuss. What you don't want to do in these conversations is say, well, somebody told me that you did X, or somebody said that they heard you say Y to somebody else. It becomes very, very difficult to have that conversation if you're working on hearsay and not being fully aware of what the facts are at the time. And you also need to test your assumptions and be ready for your preconceptions to be challenged, because your feelings and beliefs may be completely unfounded. And for obvious reasons, people don't see things from the same perspective. So you need to put yourself in the other person's shoes as well. How are they going to feel? Think about and explore their views, their feelings, and their motives as well. It's about gathering as much information as you can. Next part of the framework is your story, their story. And this is where it comes into the two-way part of the conversation. There are so many examples, particularly in the workplace, maybe around feedback, where the conversation's one way. And that's not a satisfactory way to move forward and make sure the person improves and sort of develops as an individual. So when you're presenting your side of the story, you need to explain really clearly what's given rise to your concerns and state the facts as you know them and as you see them. And I think that's really important. It's about being upfront. It's about being honest and expressing how you feel about the situation, and make your motives for having the conversation really clear from the outset. So, for example, if you were in the workplace situation and it was linked to poor performance, you might say something along the lines of, I'm frustrated because you've repeatedly missed your monthly targets. So that speaks to the emotional side. You're frustrated. You might say missing targets affects the performance of the entire team. And as a result, the team members might not receive their annual bonus. That speaks to consequence of the person's behaviors. And then you might say, look, I know you're capable of doing much better, and I want to help you realize your full potential. This speaks to motivation, which is really important as well in the conversation. Things that you shouldn't say linked to self-serving motivations. You mustn't let them come to the fore. So you shouldn't say something along the lines of, I'm really upset and angry because your actions are reflecting really badly on my own managerial skills and are also affecting my personal performance targets. It's not about you. And if you go down that route, it's going to make it really difficult to find a win-win solution. You need to take a positive and collaborative approach at this point. And during the early stages of telling your story, you need to say what's at the heart of the matter for you. So again, it's about using phrases such as, what's important to me is, what I'm really feeling is. For me, this is about a particular situation. When telling your story, you need to be really clear. Don't use vague language and generalizations such as always and never, because you can be challenged back really quickly if you do. So, for example, if you said to somebody, you're always late, they can come back and say, always, but I was on time for this meeting. If you say to somebody, you never complete a project on time, they can say, never, but you signed off on the project I completed 2 months ago. So it's about being clear and specific. And when you're telling your story, it's important to check in that the other person understands and is interpreting your side of the conversation clearly. So you can check in with them and say things like, you know, what are you hearing me say? What do you think the main points I'm trying to get across here? What would you like me to clarify? So that they get a full understanding of your perspective. And it's important not to present your story as the truth or the right interpretation of what's happening. It's how you see it. And it's important to remind the other person of that. And it's okay for them to see the problem differently. They'll get the opportunity to share their story as well. So when you're listening to their side of the story, you invite the other person to share their perspective. And again, don't assume you know exactly what they're going to say before they say it. And if what they come out and talk about differs from your assumptions, don't suggest in some way that they're perhaps being dishonest or hiding something, because their viewpoint may be at odds with yours for a really good reason. For example, they may tell you something that you had absolutely no knowledge about that can be a game changer and completely alter the way that you see it, alter your perspective on the situation. So it's about listening carefully and demonstrating that you're doing so by adopting an open posture and using body language to convey that, you know, you're considering their point of view. You don't want to sit there sort of crossed arm looking at your mobile phone while they're telling their story. That doesn't convey any openness to really hear, listen to what they're saying and engage with them as well. And it's important not to interrupt people. When they're telling their story, give them the room, give them the space, let them articulate what they want to say, because, you know, the person may feel slightly vulnerable, particularly if you interrupt them. And if you give them the opportunity to express themselves fully in their own words, it will actually empower them to and give them the confidence to state the facts fully as they see them, which is really important. The next stage of the framework is the need to speak with clarity and conviction. And it's important to have the courage to say what needs to be said, because challenging conversations are often about standing up for yourself and being assertive in expressing your wants and your needs. So that clarity, clear language is very, very important indeed. Next part's really interesting, listening deeply. And listening's a skill that we can all develop and all build upon and become more proficient at it. And it's very different from hearing. Unless you're hearing impaired or have some sort of hearing disability, everybody can hear, but not everybody can listen. And it is a skill that you can develop. And in these conversations, it's almost more important to listen more than you talk. And you can use your active listening skills to really understand their story, get more depth and insight before you come back and elaborate further. And when the person's finished speaking and making their comments, you want to ask open-ended questions. What, where, how, why, who, when, to keep the conversation going. If you ask closed-end questions where there's the only possibility of answering yes or no, that's going to close the conversation down really quickly. By asking targeted questions, having listened, you can get them to articulate even more clearly the points that they're trying to get across. And in terms of listening, it's not just about listening with your ears, it's about listening with your internal voice as well. What's your intuition telling you? What's your gut feeling telling you? And if your gut feeling's telling you something, you can bring that up into the conversation. So the person's finished speaking about, the particular issue that you're discussing, and you can say things like, well, thanks for explaining that, and I really appreciate it, but my gut feeling's telling me there's a little bit more to come out. Can you elaborate a little bit further on that issue? So gut feeling and intuition is really important, and you shouldn't be afraid of bringing that out or using phrases of that nature. And it's also important to understand that the fact you acknowledge you hear, or you're listening to them, hear them and understand someone, doesn't mean that you actually agree with them. So, for example, you could say, look, I can understand why you might see that lack of recognition for the staff at this company is an issue. I don't see it that way, and here's why. But you've acknowledged the fact that you've listened to them, and you can then move the conversation forward as well. Next stage, managing your emotions. And again, by their very nature, challenging conversations are stressful for both parties and will elicit complex emotions. And it can be difficult to remain objective when these emotions really come to the fore. And so you need to be fully aware of and self-awareness and self-control. And these are the real watchwords here. And by managing your own emotions, you're effectively encouraging the other person to do so as well. So if you're sitting having one of these conversations, emotions get a little bit heated and you start shouting, the chances are the other person's going to start shouting back. But if you're calm, you're speaking slowly, you're breathing slowly, it's likely that the other person will follow, which makes the conversation much more comfortable, and you're going to get a better result from doing that. And I think in challenging conversations, there are actually three main emotions that you need to be aware of and manage. And the first one's how you feel about instigating the conversation in the first place. So it's natural to feel apprehensive, maybe even embarrassed about starting a challenging conversation, as well as being nervous and fearful about how the other person's going to respond. And it's very important not to make these conversations personal, because once you get personal, it's going to throw up even more emotions that might arise anyway. Second emotion you need to be aware of and manage is how you feel about the issue being discussed. So again, don't let your own feelings cloud your judgment and affect how you're going to get involved in the conversation. So if the matter concerns something that's a personal bugbear, so for example, laziness or lateness, don't let your feelings impact on how you deal with the issue. On the other side, if it's something you're not feeling that strongly about, again, don't approach it in a casual manner or suggest that, there's no big deal to this, because there may well be for the other person. So your approach needs to be fair, it needs to be consistent, and not based on your own subjective feelings. Third emotion, and this is probably the most complex and challenging, is how you feel about the person involved. And if the person's somebody you really like, they're a valued member of your team perhaps, you really respect them, you may feel awkward, embarrassed, or even angry that you need to have the conversation with them at all. And if you're going to have that conversation, you may be tempted in some instances to soften the blow of the message. Don't do that, because it won't lead to a good result. So you've got to tell it how it is, don't soften the blow. Conversely, if it's somebody you find difficult to get on with, or you've clashed with them in the past, you've had lots of arguments, don't let those feelings of dislike, anger, or frustration get in the way of the conversation. It's about treating everybody with respect and fairness, and making sure the conversation focuses on the facts and not the person. So you've gone through that process. Now you come to the really important part, finding solutions, hopefully in a collaborative way. So you've both listened to one another, you've heard both sets of stories, you've asked questions, you've listened, and you've come to a common understanding of what the essence of the problem is. And it's time to move on to find the solution. And again, what's really important here, you need to focus on the present and the future rather than the past. You've discussed the past, you're here now in the present, and you want to move forward. So brainstorming is a really good strategy. You want to bring as many options to the table as possible so you can find the right solutions for you. So step back, consider all the options on the table, and find out which ones meet and address both of your concerns. And this is likely to rely on some sort of compromise. And it's often the case that you may get stuck at this point, because not every challenging conversation can be resolved by mutual agreement. So if you get stuck, there are a number of questions you might want to ask to sort of move the situation forward. So again, questions like, what's still missing? What are the other possible options that we haven't considered? Do we need somebody else to help us find a solution? Why are we stuck? What changes might we be able to make that the promising solutions that we've come up with, how can we change them to satisfy both of us? And where else might we be able to compromise? And it's also possible that at this point you may need to ask this critical question. Are we both prepared to walk away and accept the consequences of not reaching an agreement? And you actually need to discuss what the consequences might be, because they can be really serious. And this question will often break the impasse and help both parties move towards a compromise. So having gone through the entire process, you come up with a solution and you're ready to move forward. But you also need to be clear what the solution is and what it means for individual behaviours and actions going forward. So the agreement will mean things such as, we both will do the following, you will, and I will. So it's important to really highlight how these new behaviours and actions are going to be embedded. And it may well be the case that you need to have a few more follow-up conversations just to make sure things are moving forward in the right direction as agreed. So one of the best books, and I'd highly recommend it, that I've read in recent years is called Fierce Conversations by Susan Scott. And just want to take a quote from this, which I think resonates with the framework as I've just outlined it. And she says in the book, don't take the conversation away from the other person and fill the airtime with your stories. This practice of taking the conversation away from the other person and making it about ourselves goes on every day, and is a huge relationship killer and a waste of time. So what she's in effect saying here, it's not just about your story, it's about the other person's story. It's not just about you talking and interrupting, it's about you listening. encouraging the other person to speak, because what you don't want to do is break the relationship and make everybody feel that they've wasted their time. The next thing I want to look at, and given that we've got an international audience here, is cross-cultural conversations. And to be honest, most of us don't enjoy having challenging conversations, period, for some of the reasons that I outlined earlier. But when they involve somebody from our own culture, it's often easier because we sort of know the ground rules. We know what we can say, we know what we can't say. Can we have some chit chat beforehand or not, depending on the culture. But when we have a challenging conversation with somebody from another culture, it becomes even more difficult because you've got the topic at hand, which is going to be really challenging. And we also have to have that conversation by maneuvering around several cross-cultural tripwires that could get in the way of a solution to the problem that you're going to be discussing. And there are basically 4 common cultural tripwires and cultural differences that I want to explore briefly with you. There's the getting down to business versus relationship building. There's direct versus indirect communication. There's low versus high context, and informality versus formality. So getting down to business versus relationship building, how does this look? So in some countries like the US, for example, people view conversations as an opportunity for exchanging information. They want to get down to business quickly, get to the bottom line, resolve the problem. And there may be a little bit of chit chat along the way, but ultimately it's about getting down to business quickly. Whereas in countries such as Mexico, conversations are first and foremost around enhancing the relationship, cultivating goodwill, and reinforcing those feelings of interdependence and mutual obligation. So, what are the dangers in the conversation here? So in this case, if the American, for example, got to the point too quickly, the Mexican person would feel confused about why they were being treated so aggressively, and may also leave the conversation or the meeting feeling really devalued, which is what you wouldn't want to happen. Conversely, if the Mexican focuses on the relationship side of things instead of getting to the point, the American in this case may well wonder what the conversation's about and may feel that their time's being wasted as well. And the Mexican person may also try so hard to avoid making any waves that the American winds up assuming that there's actually no problem to address at all. Second one I want to look at is direct versus indirect communication. So in countries like Germany, it's a sign of respect and professionalism. You need to speak really clearly, no room for misinterpretation in the words and the language that you're using. Whereas by contrast, in countries like Japan, people prefer to communicate indirectly. So they'll use subtle hints, they'll use vague references, and more general statements. So what are the dangers here? The German person in this case may come across as insensitive and ill-mannered to the Japanese person, while the Japanese person may appear closed and perhaps seem like they're holding something back and don't want to reveal their true stance. The third one is low versus high context. So again, if you take a country like Canada, for example, the message of the conversation and the point is contained in the exact words that are being spoken. They'll take some notice of posture and facial expression as well. Whereas in countries like South Korea, for example, conversation participants are scanning for meaning on completely different frequencies. They're reading between the lines, they're paying close attention to the emotional side of the conversation, and the setting and relationship status and social context is really important. So again, the dangers here, in this case, the Canadian person may think that they're communicating a very specific, focused, and limited message, but the South Korean person may infer all kinds of unintended messages and different options which could take the conversation in many different directions. And the South Korean person may believe that they're presenting a rich tapestry of nuanced meaning, but the Canadian person's only hearing the words that are spoken. So again, there are some big differences that have to be overcome here. And the final one is informality versus formality. So in some countries, such as Australia, where people are generally a little bit more casual and laid back, they may try to diffuse any tension in the conversation and want to get it done without making too much fuss. In other countries, such as Poland, people will expect a degree of ceremony and gravity to match the topic and the importance of the topic. It's likely to take place in a formal location, and there'll be a lot of protocol that needs to be followed. So again, what are the dangers here? In this case, the Australian may unintentionally appear like they don't care enough to make an effort, or may inadvertently undermine the topic of the conversation. The person from Poland, in this case, might decide that they're going to actually up the ante because of the formality and protocol and so on. And they could make the Australian person believe that the situation is much worse than originally thought, and the conversation is going to be much more serious, which would in turn put them on edge. So what can you do about cross-cultural conversations? And here's a checklist that you can apply. First thing you need to do is look at the conversation and identify places where you may trip up so you can avoid doing so. Second thing you need to do is be aware of what you know about the other person and their culture. And if you don't know very much, you better do your research, or it's going to be a really challenging conversation. Thirdly, look at places for style overlap opportunities. So again, if you're from a culture where there's a lot of formality and protocol, you may need to maybe adapt your approach and have maybe 5-10 minutes chit chat about family, sport, whatever it might be, over a cup of coffee before getting into the conversation itself. And the final one is focus on the tripwire that matters most and prioritize it to avoid tripping up. So there we go. Challenging conversations. Just hand back to Sophia for facilitating some questions.